So thanks a lot for joining us. My name is Ilias Papaioannou, and I'm a professor of economics at the London Business School, where together with Rajesh Chandy, we are the academic co-directors of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, which was established something like 7-8 years ago with a very generous donation of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, who you all know since they are the founders of Lonely Planet. So thanks to them, I have been to Chile, I have been to Russia, although I haven't been, actually I've been to Russia to be fair. So the Wheeler Institute was established by the London Business School because we are very passionate about some of the world's most important and profound topics, and today's public lecture will be about that. Will be about the rise of authoritarian populism, and we will try, thanks to our distinguished guests, to have in some sense a panorama both on a global scene but also on the evolution of populism since its start. Our two guests will tell us when. So let me briefly introduce our distinguished guests. I'm very happy to call them also friends. Sergei Guriev is a professor of economics at Sciences Po, and recently he took the ambitious job of being the vice provost in a French institution. So provost at Sciences Po. Sergei, I would say, is one of the most prolific economists. He is doing super important work, initially on corporate finance, over time in macroeconomics, more recently on political economy. He has been a friend of the school. I cannot count how many times he has been so kind to join us in the World Economy in the Emerging Markets elective that we teach. Most recently, Sergei released a book called Spin Dictators, which shows this new style of autocracy that we see more and more on the rise nowadays. We were happy to do an event here a couple of months ago. I strongly urge you to have a look. Sergei was working on this topic many years ago, so in some sense he was at the forefront of that. And let me further say that one of the great things with Sergei is that he's also trying to communicate the research to a wider public and try to go from academic research, actually the most rigorous academic research, to having a profound impact on the way policy making is being conducted. Now, our other guest is Andres Velasco. Andres Velasco, for the academics in the room, and we have been organizing a conference on populism, is an important figure in academic research on emerging markets and macroeconomics. Andres was for many years a professor of economics at Columbia University, and then he moved to the Kennedy School of Government. And his research is about emerging market crisis. That's at least the first papers of his I read. Subsequently, he went from academia into policy making, and he was the finance minister of Chile from 2006, if I'm not mistaken, till 2010, where he received a lot of world praise for being prudent, or for making Chile to be prudent. Subsequently, he ran for the presidency. Perhaps Chile lost, but academia won him back. And currently, he is the dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics. Let me also say that Andres also writes at the Project Syndicate, so he tries to communicate academic research and have an impact on the way we think about some of the world's, and Latin America in the case of Andres, topical issues. And I read with interest his latest pieces on Latin America, especially since a couple of weeks ago we celebrated the 50 years since the assassination of Salvador Allende, the former president of Chile. So we have kindly asked Marta Verani, a London Business School student, to moderate the discussion. Marta has worked, actually she holds a master's also from the London School of Economics. She has worked for many years in non-profits and the United Nations, and she's also the co-president of the Social Impact Club. So without further notice, let me first call Sergei to give his remarks, then we move to Andres, and then Marta will moderate the discussion, and then we will leave something like 15 minutes, perhaps even more, for general questions. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Elias, for your generous introduction. It's a big honor and pleasure to be here, and indeed I will not talk too much about the book because we discussed the book in January here in this very room. I will talk about populism, and I'm trying to see how I navigate the slides. It works. Okay. So A great secret is that the work I'm going to discuss was written together with Elias Papaioannou. So this is a survey of recent research in populism, mostly papers in economics and political science written since 2016. And basically what I'm going to talk about is some of those questions. This 100-page survey of literature focuses on those 4 questions. What is populism, how to measure it? Whenever we talk about populism, there is always an issue of definition and measurement, and so it's not actually obvious. The second question is why populism, why now? And the third question is, if populism is on the rise, do we need to worry? Do we have to worry? And if we have to worry, what should we do about this? So I'll briefly talk about some of those questions. I'm going to stick to 10 minutes. And one of the things which connects my talk and Andres' talk is that if you ask an economist 10 years ago, 15 years ago, what populism is, they would give you this definition, which would describe macroeconomic populism from Latin America. And that would be the populism that economists would have in mind, and they would use the definition of non-sustainable macroeconomic policy, over-promising fiscal expenditure, which is not sustainable. And basically, that was the populism of the second half of the 20th century. We still have some left-wing populists who make unsustainable macroeconomic promises today, but the populism has actually changed. We see the rise of right-wing populism, and not just in Latin America, which we do, and Andres is going to talk about this, but also in other countries, including, most importantly, in Europe and United States. And so then economists understood that it's time to talk to non-economists. And we've done that, and we've discovered that political scientists have done a lot of work on populism, and in particular came up with this definition, which is much more operational when we want to understand the modern populism, the populism of the 21st century. And this is in particular the definition which comes from Cas Mudde's work and his co-author Cristobal Ravira Kaltwasser, which is populism is not a doctrine, it's a view of the world, where the view of the world is very simple. There are corrupt elites and there are pure people, and the pure people should rule the country. And one other thing, in addition to this anti-elitism, is homogeneity of both groups. This is very important, that populists believe that people are the same, so you don't really need checks and balances. You just need one person to represent them all. I'm simplifying a bit, but basically this idea of anti-elitism and anti-pluralism is the key to the modern understanding of what populism is. Now, very quickly, one takeaway I would like you to know is that we live in the time of unprecedented rise of populism. This comes from a paper by Funke, Szularik, and Trebesh, which is now being published in the top economic journal, American Economic Review. So this paper looks at 60 largest countries in the world whose GDP accounts for 95% of global GDP. They go back 100 years and they count how many populists were in power at each particular moment. And you see here right-wing populists, left-wing populists, and you see a huge rise in populism in 21st century. Their data go through until 2018. In 2018, about a quarter of those countries, so 16 out of 60 countries, actually had populists in government, in power. And this is much higher than even before the First and the Second World War. So we do live in a time where populism is not just something that we notice, it actually exists. And these politicians are not just in the street or on the ballots, they are actually in government offices. Now, if we go back to the issue of the ballots, and this is also important, even if populists don't win, they actually influence debate and policy making. Non-populist politicians take notice that populists are gaining vote share and change their rhetoric, change their policy making as well. So it's important also to look at vote share that populists get around the world, and in particular in Europe. And once again, defining populism is never easy. So some people look at rhetoric, some people look at manifestos, some people look at those anti-elitist, anti-pluralist policies proposed by the populists. And so definitions are somewhat different. But here, this is a chart from our survey with Elias. We take 4 different definitions of populist parties in Europe, and the results are pretty much the same. If you basically want to think about what's happened in the 21st century, the answer is, in an average European country, populists in the beginning of the century would get 10–15% of the vote. Then by the end of the first decade, they would gain another 5 percentage points of the vote. And by the end of the second decade, they would get another 10–15% of the vote. So now we are living in Europe where populists are getting 25–30% of the vote, and it's a norm rather than an exception. Whatever definition of populist party you use, you end up with this graph. So why and why now? There is a debate, and this event is actually part of a research conference on populism organized by Wheeler Institute and Center for Economic Policy Research. And research is ongoing, but there is a general agreement that there are several factors which come together. You have long-term economic trends such as globalization, which creates winners and losers. And when national governments don't take care of people left behind, these people vote for populists who offer them protection and promise to stand up to cosmopolitan elites who stand behind the globalization to hurt these people who are left behind by globalization. Same with technological change, robotization, automation. Then you also have one-off events such as global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and the subsequent austerity in some countries, which also left people behind. Then there is also a debate about cultural factors, such as cultural backlash of people who oppose postmodernist values, sometimes which is called woke culture, political correctness, and what's called silent revolution, the change of values that is propagated through generational change. You also have anti-immigration and identitarian rise of identitarian culture in several countries. And then, of course, you have communications technology. So we discuss those factors. We look at the interactions between those factors. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to talk more about this, but just a list of factors that I would mention. And I will just show you some graphs on some of those factors. But basically, I already mentioned globalization and automation. Both are good for the world, and the Wheeler Institute works on business and development, and whoever works in development economics can tell you the last 30–40 years have been great for fighting global poverty. Lots of people have benefited. Hundreds of millions of people were taken from extreme poverty. Just to give you one statistic, early 80s, about 45% of global population were in extreme poverty. If we measure it at something like $2 per day in today's dollars, today this number is about 10%. So it's good that we had globalization and technological change. But that also created losers, and many national governments did not take care of the losers from globalization, and that, of course, created fertile grounds for the populists. Now, global financial crisis was also an interesting event where elites definitely screwed up. And then in countries where austerity followed, unemployment was high, social welfare benefits were cut. And so again, you saw that somewhere very well-paid bankers and policymakers made mistakes, and I am sitting here without a job and without social benefits. So that's also something that is very, very clear. So one of the papers, one of our first papers we wrote with Elias and Jan Algan and Evgenia Passari on this, we looked at voting in Europe, and we tried to see how impact of the crisis contributed to populism. And basically, we looked at not just at countries, but at subnational regions in those countries. And we found that every percentage point increase due to the crisis in unemployment rate resulted in one, or actually in some specifications, 2 percentage point increase in voting for populists. So this is just a chart where you see difference in unemployment rate before and after the crisis, and the increase in voting share of populists. And each dot represents a subnational region in Europe, and there is a very tight positive relationship. And actually, since we are in the United Kingdom, we did that for United Kingdom as well. And again, when you look at 379, 380 electoral districts in the UK, you also have this strong correlation between the change in unemployment before and after the crisis and vote share for Brexit. Now, one last thing I would like to say to stick to my 10 minutes, I would just mention that we live in an era of unprecedented development in mobile broadband internet. We are much better connected today. I see a lot of young people, you don't remember the time when we didn't have 3G. 3G really came to the world in about 2007, 2008. Since then, especially in developed countries, people are connected to internet through 3G, 4G, and 5G technology. When we think about fixed broadband technology, it's grown much less. So most people now get their information from mobile devices. And that, of course, changed the political equilibrium. And we find, and this is a paper that we wrote together with Nikita Melnikov, who's here, and Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, we show that as mobile broadband internet was spreading throughout Europe, it was actually helping the right-wing and left-wing populists. This is a graph which shows the magnitudes. So basically, on the top left chart, we show that the increase in the share of coverage by 3G, 4G technology, you have, if you move from 0 coverage to 100% coverage, the share of populist vote share for right-wing populists goes up by 9 percentage points, for left-wing populists by 6 percentage points. In reality, in this period between 2007 and 2018, the coverage changed in Europe from 40% to 90%. So you need to divide these numbers by about 2. But basically, half of the increase of populist vote share in Europe is due to 3G, 4G mobile broadband internet. That's, of course, very well studied. This is social media, disinformation, misinformation, false news, alternative facts circulating through new information technology used by populists. If you have questions, I'll tell you this is a feature and not a bug of populist narrative, which is usually taking advantage of new communications technology. This is not the first time in history, but we are living in the environment where populist communication technology is very much related to new technology. And finally, what's happened when populists got in power? Andres will talk about the disastrous implications of populism in power in Latin America. I will just say a few things about how economists think about how populism in power differ from potential counterfactual. So how do we measure that? Since we are in the UK, economists would need to build a counterfactual to UK economy, UK economic trajectory. What would happen if not for Brexit referendum? What would happen if the Brexit referendum would result in Remain vote? So what they do, they look at the data before 2016, before June 2016. They look at similar countries, OECD countries. They build a weighted average of those countries that would fit the pre-referendum trajectory. And then they extrapolate this doppelganger, this counterfactual, after June 2016. And that's the graph. So that's the graph from a paper by my colleague Moritz Schularik, who is now director of Kiel Institute for World Economy. So you see that before the Brexit referendum, the blue line, which is the actual UK economic trajectory, and the red line, which is this counterfactual, go together. That's how it's constructed. But if you look what happened after the referendum, you see that actual economic performance is lower, and the difference is about 1 percentage point per year. 1% of GDP per year. We are talking about several hundred pounds per capita in terms of lost income. This is the same graph zoomed in, so you see how that actually changed dramatically. Now, one last bit of information that I will give you. The same authors did that for all populists in government around the world. And so they can tell you that once you compare populists in power over the last 100 years with potential counterfactuals constructed in the same way, you find that populists, again, destroy economic growth to the extent of about 10% relative to counterfactual in the 15 years after populists come to power. It's, again, about 1% per year. then you see no decline in equality, you see rising protectionism, you see declining quality of institutions, and you also see that populists, after they destroy political institutions, want to stay in power, and that's exactly what Elias referred to when he talked about authoritarian populists. It's actually not an exception, but a norm. When populists come to power, they see that they don't deliver in economic terms, so they cannot actually say, yes, we performed as we promised, my promises are implemented. No, they see that the public is not very happy, that economic benefits are not coming through. So what populists do, they instead start to take over courts, media, and then they try to stay in power through non-democratic means. Some populists are democratic, there are some, but on average, populists actually are more likely to destroy courts and media freedom. And that's the graph, the same graph I showed, comparison of populist performance versus counterfactual, and you see that they underperform by about 10% per year in 15 years. So just to stop here and conclude, we have 4 questions. On what should be done question, I hope we speculate after, but on the other questions, what is populism, anti-elitism, anti-pluralism, what are the drivers? As I said, there is strong evidence for economic factors, less conclusive evidence for non-economic factors, strong evidence for technological factors. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to talk about that. And then populists in power mostly underperform. There are exceptions, and I'm happy to take questions about exceptions. In a debate like this, people always raise a hand and say, I know a country where populists have done a good job, and I know these countries as well, and I'm happy to talk about this. But on average, populists underperform. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Elias, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Sergey, for actually making my job much easier, because many of the things that he has said I was going to say, but I can skip them now. But there are 1 or 2 where we probably disagree. And I will say outright that I am perfectly willing to buy all of his very detailed and serious econometric work on the sources of populism in Europe. I would not buy that story for other bits of the world, for reasons that I will make evident. And I will also have a caveat, which is he showed you properly identified regressions. I'm going to show you basically scatter plots. So, he's a serious guy, but, then again, I used to be a politician, so why should you believe me, right? So the first thing that I want to do is claim some intellectual property rights here, because my region of the world, we don't get the credit that we actually deserve. We invented the damn thing, right? When I speak before American audiences, I always can get a very cheap laugh by saying that compared to the Latin American populists, Donald Trump is just, he's just an apprentice, right? And it is true. And, this quote, if you don't know who these people are, on top that's Perón from Argentina, on the left is Getulio Vargas from Brazil, and on the right is Carlos Ibáñez del Campo from Chile. He was married to a great aunt of mine, but I have nothing to do with the man. But I want to take a second to read this quote, because I think it's really perfect. When Ibáñez comes to power in Chile in '52, Perón, who likes him a lot, and he says, let me tell you what governing is about. He sends him a letter, and this is a letter. He says, my dear friend, give the people, especially the workers, as much as you can. And once you think you're giving them too much, give them more. And then, only then, will you see the results. Of course, the economists will come and they will frighten you with a specter of economic collapse. Don't believe them, they're lying, because there's nothing more elastic than the economy, of which so many are frightened because no one really understands it, okay? So there's no better statement of populism than that, right? When you think you're giving them too much, give them more. And when, people like us come say, oh, balance of payments crisis, too much debt, don't believe them. They have no idea what they're talking about. Perón did drive the Argentine economy into an abyss from which it is still trying to recuperate. Ibáñez didn't really have majority, so he didn't do much harm. But so, my family's honor is duly protected. We did not screw up entirely. So, you saw this quote already. The standard classic definition of populism, which, again, is Latin American, is you have governments that spend too much, tax too little, borrow too much, and eventually things blow up. A big, big, big question, which I'm not going to talk about, but there are lots of papers out there as to why it is that people do this. I mean, if we're somewhat forward-looking, you don't have to have a PhD from MIT to understand that if you're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and the debt-to-GDP ratio is rising, and you're not the US, right? I used to say that the UK could do this too, but then we had the mini budget. And so the UK is not in the same category. The UK is really an emerging market. But for most countries, except for the US, you can see the end, right? So with some forward-looking expectations, you should think that this is going to blow up. Why the hell do you do that? There are lots of papers about that. My favorite one is from your old friend and teacher, Alberto Alesina, with Danny Roderick on games of attrition and wars of attrition, whatever. And I will not say more about that because I want to claim that, we have Venezuela still, a country where populism is rampant. 1,000,000% inflation is something to be proud of. And of course, we have Argentina, where, this year inflation will be about 180%. In today's world, which is mostly, or has been until recently, a low inflation world, achieving 180% requires some effort. Really, and they've managed it. And that's the current president. That's the vice president. Who really runs the show is not altogether clear. But these are textbook examples. I mean, you don't have to be a monetarist. You don't need to be educated at the University of Chicago to understand that if you have a big deficit of 8 points of GDP and you print enough money, you're going to get inflation, right? I'm not a Chicago boy. I understand that, okay? Now, the fascinating thing is that I don't think that this is really the norm, okay? And we're going to be convergent here because crazy people who have big deficits and print money to finance those deficits, yes, there's some, but they're surprisingly few. Or to put the same proposition the other way around, there's surprisingly many left-wing populists who are actually fiscally orthodox. And I have two here. The former president of Bolivia, who announced yesterday that he wants to be the next president of Bolivia. Not my favorite politician, but I will give him credit for having been quite austere in the use of natural gas revenues. Bolivia is a fairly big natural gas producer. And the current president of Mexico. I've done some work on the fiscal response to the fiscal crisis, and Mexico is a complete outlier. Mexico had unfettered market access, only about 50–55% of GDP and public debt, and did nothing, okay? This is the time when the IMF was saying to countries, spend, 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 and he did nothing, and he was, I'm sure there are Mexicans in the room who can tell me why he didn't do what he had to do. The most common view is that he doesn't like credit cards, which, I don't like credit cards either, but I like spending on credit cards. In any case, the point that I'm trying to make, which is more serious, is that you can have what I'm going to define as populism without having fiscal or debt populism. And I think that's interesting. And of course, that takes us into what Sergey was telling you about, what I will call political populism. And you quoted Cas Mare and my fellow Chilean Cristóbal Rovira. I'm going to quote the other guru of populism, a German guy who teaches at Princeton called Miller. And I'm not going to read the quote, but Miller basically says populism is a style of politics, and in that style of politics, there are good people and bad people. And there's always a populist, of course, is the spokesperson for the good people against the bad people. In one bit of a book, he says it is a moralizing approach to politics. No ideology, nothing about how you organize society. That's why populism can be right-wing or left-wing, but a way of conducting politics in which pluralism is denied. Pluralism is you have a view, I have a view, I respect yours, you respect mine. Nah. Complexity is denied. There was a former LSE president many years ago who wrote a paper saying, it's very simple, democracy is complex, populism is simple. I remember years ago, I have a son who's today 13, when he was about 6, he was playing with blocks, and I arrived at home one evening, and I said, what are you doing? And he said, I am building a wall. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I saw it on the telly. Trump is building a wall. I'm doing it too, As a politician, let me tell you, I would love to have a policy that 7-year-old children across the world knew about, right? And what's the beauty? It's simple. Migration is complex. It has to do with economics and climate change and society, whatever. Oh, screw all that. They're evil Mexicans, I'm going to build a wall, right? So simplicity, the denial of complexity, the denial of pluralism, the moralization of politics, that's what we're talking about. And of course, this is a worldwide phenomenon. Those are people not from Latin America. You all know them, and this is exactly what they do. Some come from rich countries, some come from poor countries, some come from the East or the West. Some are quite fiscally austere, or others are quite fiscally lax. What they do have in common is this divisive, moralizing, oversimplifying approach to politics. Now, something which Sergei did not say is that there are some distinguishing features to what you might call left-wing or right-wing populism, but it's not ideology, nothing about the size of the state or regulation. It is basically who the good people or the bad people are. Left-wing populism is what you said. It's very simple. There's the people, and then there are the corrupt elites. That's simple. You need two actors. And this guy called Judis, an American historian and writer, calls that dyadic populism. There are two, right? But if you're right-wing populist, it's more difficult, right? Because you need a bad guy, and the bad guy cannot be the people. So who is this bad guy? Well, the non-people. And the non-people is foreigners, migrants, neighbors, racial minorities, sexual minorities, the other, okay? And this is very powerful across the world, including in Latin America. What is striking in my view about Latin America is we've done a massive shift recently from one kind of populism to the other. Those are the classic left-wing populists in Latin America. Latin Americans in the room will recognize the very young guy over there on the right. That's Alan Garcia, the former president of Peru. And I had the young picture of him because he ruled twice. The first time he was a mad populist, drove the country into hyperinflation. The second time around, he was a conservative social democrat. So, people can change. He ended up dead by suicide, so it's not a happy story, but still. But the point I'm trying to make is that these guys are no longer running the show. The people running the show are these guys, okay? Bolsonaro, Milei, Hernandez, and from my own country, Cast, who are actually quite orthodox economically. Well, what Milei believes in economics, I have no idea. Happy to engage on that. Does Bolsonaro think about economics? Probably not. It would be too complex for him. But on the whole, these are fairly orthodox people when it comes to economics. Nonetheless, they're radical populists in the vein that you defined. I have a running debate with my friend Danny Roderick on populism. We used to be colleagues and co-authors at the Kennedy School. And Danny used to say, oh, no, but the causes of populism are economic. And the best bit of evidence for this is, in Latin America, there's really an equal bit of the world. They're all left-wing populists, so it must be economics. And in Europe, it must be something else, right? I take some delight at, every time a right-wing populist wins an election in Latin America, I say to Danny, well, not so clear anymore, right? A trend that was began by Bolsonaro. Hernandez over there, a Colombian, didn't win, but he made it to the second round. You can't really tell in that picture, but he has exactly the same orange complexion as Donald Trump. But this is quite striking. Now, let me get into a little, that's description. Let's try to attempt a little explanation. So what is it about Latin America that makes us so populism prone? That's question one. And a more difficult question is, why now? What is it about the world today that has caused this sort of surge? And there is a narrative, which is very common. I like to call it the New York Times narrative, which is basically Latin America is becoming more unequal. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The quality of life is dropping for the vast majority, so it's no surprise that people are upset. And whenever a populist, right-wing, left-wing, is on the ballot, you vote for the populist because you think the elites are no good. Okay? This is very popular. It is very sexy. It is very widespread. It is often quoted, and it's plain wrong. Okay? And the reason why it's plain wrong, I can do some fancy econometrics, but I won't. Let me just show you two pictures, okay? The words first, the pictures later. Until the pandemic, income distribution in Latin America was improving massively, okay? And until the pandemic, the quality of life in Latin America was also improving massively. So the statement that people were getting poor and inequality was rising and quality of life was dropping and therefore people went populist is you don't really need any fancy econometric. It's just plain wrong. Let me show you two pictures. This is from a paper I did recently for the group of 30. This is the Gini coefficient from the World Bank. The red countries are Latin American countries. The blue countries is what we call a peer group. So you have other middle-income countries like Hungary and Poland and also Indonesia and South Africa and Turkey, sort of, the peers of Latin America. Greece graduated. Greece is not there. Almost, but you're not there. You're not there, but Turkey is. And the Gini coefficient in 2018 is on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, the Gini coefficient in 2006. And of course, if you are above the 45-degree line, your Gini coefficient was higher back then than it is today. So Latin America is striking for two reasons. First of all, Latin America is to the northeast. So yes, we are more unequal than Hungary or Poland or Turkey. You knew that already. But what is striking is that every country is above the 45-degree line. So in every country, the Gini coefficient was substantially higher in 2006, my base year, compared to 2018, okay? So the beloved statement by the New York Times that the increase in inequality caused an increase in dissatisfaction, wrong. Second picture from my recent paper, this is the UNDP Human Development Index. Blue is the peers, and red is Latin America. And the truth of the matter is that since 1990, these two lines move very, very, very much hand in hand. There's a little bit of a deviation maybe in the last 4 or 5 years because, you know, Latin America was benefiting from the commodity boom and the commodity boom ended. But you know, the slope is still very positive, right? So again, the statement that quality of life and, you know, human development was dropping is complete and total nonsense. I'm going to take 2 more minutes if Marta will allow me just to do so let me, if that New York Times narrative is wrong, let me just mention, I will not dig into them, 4 plausible alternatives. And here I have no econometrics, I just have conjectures, so bear with me. I'm sure very much younger and much brighter people in the room will do the right statistical work to make this point, but I'm just going to give you a few ideas for papers, guys. I'm going to skip that. The first one is what I like to call the Tocqueville effect. You've all read Democracy in America. I will not read the quote, it's a lovely quote, but basically the Tocqueville says, when countries are very unequal, who cares about inequality? When countries become more equal and more prosperous, then inequality stands out. And so you have a paradox. The tolerance for inequality tends to rise as the measured inequality goes down. And he observed this in America in the mid-19th century. I would say that to some extent this is true today. There's a beautiful paper by Albert Hirschman that nobody reads anymore, written in the late 70s, called The Changing Tolerance for Inequality in the Course of Economic Development, in which Hirschman makes exactly this point. He says, you were in the tunnel, what's it called? The Sumner Tunnel in Boston, going to, you know, if you ever lived in Boston, you know that getting out of Boston on Friday at 5 p.m. is a nightmare. So you're in Sumner Tunnel trying to go to the airport, and nobody's moving. You're quiet, you know, what the hell? You're in a tunnel, you know. The other lane begins to move, and what happens to you? You become agitated. These guys are moving. You know, I'm really upset, okay? So movement, which is progress, triggers anxiety. I think some of that has happened in the region. The second thing that's happened in the region is what I'm going to call the Machuca effect, after one of my favorite Chilean movies. It's a movie about a private school in the posh bits of Santiago which begins to take poor kids on scholarship. And, you know, how abused they are and what a bad time they have. And the point is this. When you have a society that's completely immobile, where the poor live over there and the rich live over here, and where there's complete education segmentation so that the middle classes and the working classes never get to university, well, people don't know really how the other half lives. Suddenly you have more prosperity, you have a bit more mobility, people go to university, people get degrees, and then guess what? They graduate, and people say, oh, by the way, what's your zip code? Oh, no, you come from the wrong part of town. I'm not going to hire you. There's no human being more pissed off on earth than someone who went to engineering school for 5 years, graduated at the top of his class or her class, borrowed to go to a private school, and then doesn't get a good job because his skin is the wrong color or because his zip code is wrong. It is infuriating, it is unfair, but it's a strange thing, right? Because 30 years ago, that man or woman would not have been an engineer. So progress, access to education, but the frustration at the glass ceiling because of prejudice is tremendous. This is a massive issue in Latin America that is beginning to get studied, but not so much. Number 3, I'm going to commit an atrocity here because I'm going to explain one endogenous variable with another endogenous variable. That's not an explanation. So let me just point to a correlation. And if we have time, I'll give you the sketch of a model which determines both the endogenous variables jointly. Something very, 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 very striking about Latin America is how low every measure of confidence is and how much has been falling. So that's the World Value Survey. Again, for this recent paper, Latin America is red, the peers are blue. This is the share of people who report having great deal of trust in the government. You know, it's less than 10%. Okay? In Latin America, it's less than 5%. Less than 5%. A great deal of trust. Some trust is another 10%. Okay? So you add them both, you get 15. Okay? I mean, not even the Greeks are this cynical, right? You know, my country, my skinny country of Chile had a big social explosion in 2019. And you know, I've been thinking, you know, how do you explain this? One very striking fact, and again, I'm only making a correlation claim here, but I think it's food for thought. Most indicators of trust in institutions collapsed in the year before. You know, political parties, the Senate, the Catholic Church, the judiciary, and Carabineros is the Chilean police. Again, the New York Times will tell you that Chile is a very conservative country, then everybody loves the Catholic Church. That graphic suggests, I mean, that picture suggests otherwise, right? Collapse in the Catholic Church, you know, very low, very, very low. Political parties, look at the blue line. Again, less than 10%. The police, way down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you need an account of why that happened, right? That's endogenous. And I'm not going to try to do that now, but there are stories that one could tell. And the last thing I'll say, and I promise I will stop here, is that I am increasingly convinced that Latin America has a serious problem in the design of its political system. In the world, you can have parliamentary systems, the UK, or presidential systems, the US. You can have proportional representation, much of continental Europe, or majoritarian systems, the US or the UK. 2 by 2 gives you 4. There are 4 possible cells in the matrix. The only region in the planet that has presidential regimes with proportional representation is Latin America, okay? And it is the worst system possible. Why? Because you have presidential elections with 2 rounds, so the person who wins makes a very fiery speech saying, I have a mandate from the people, I've just won an election, I have, you know, 40-some%, I mean 51% in the second round. But that person typically has 15% in the Congress, or the Parliament, or the Assembly. That is today true in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, and a number of other countries. And this is the perfect recipe for voter frustration, because he or she, who won the election, made lots of promises, and he or she is not delivering. He or she knows that they're not delivering simply because they don't have the votes, right? But the voter doesn't really know the intricacies of political or parliamentary negotiations. The voter says, I had a promise, no delivery, kick them all out, vote for a populist, okay? So I will end by saying that maybe there's some thinking about political structures and political reform that could really be helpful in getting rid of this terrible disease in Latin America. Finally, I do believe that the internet and all of that has a role, but I have nothing to add to the really good stuff that Sergey said, so I will simply, we could go on and on and on and on, but I will stop. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. That was so insightful, and thank you so much, everyone, for listening. We will now start a series of questions. We'll do a bit of a discussion and then leave around 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so save your questions for the end. So you both went through a lot of details about the causes and some of like the implications of populism. And why don't we move on now to talk about the impact, and specifically, since a lot of people here in the room are from London Business School or engaged in the world of business, why don't we talk about the impact that it has on the business landscape, on businesses, business leaders, and so on. Sergey, why don't you kick us off?
Yes, thank you. I briefly mentioned that the data on populism show that most populists actually undermine checks and balances, and that sometimes means economic checks and balances which provide protection for investors, defend property rights, rule of law, which is very important for investors. You also have a problem of competition authorities, central banks, which provide stability of financial system, stability of competition. Sometimes these guys look like unelected technocrats. I just came from Europe last night, across the channel. In Europe, we have a supranational competition authority, and even if France and Germany want their biggest companies to merge, sometimes unelected technocrats from Brussels say, we defend European consumers. And sorry, you cannot do that. And populists can say they do something wrong, but this actually reassures investors you have a big common market, which attracts companies that can compete with monopolies, oligopolies, which are being split. And even platforms get regulated in Europe. Andres mentioned that populism is the biggest export of Latin America. When people in Europe think what Europe exports, America exports technology, Latin America exports populism, China exports surveillance technology, Russia exports fear, and Europe exports regulation. So Europe is actually very proud that it sometimes creates pro-business regulation. Some people disagree, but it may actually help to fight monopolies to allow entry. And in that sense, populists who attack economic checks and balances and rule of law also attack business opportunities. And this is why I mentioned that populists usually underperform. Some populists are pro-business. For example, Andres mentioned right-wing populists such as Milei. I fully agree that we don't know what Milei's economic program is. He actually wants to eliminate inflation through dollarization.
We do know that his 4 cloned dogs will tell him what the program
That's
is.
correct. That's correct. Yeah, so he says, I'll eliminate inflation through dollarization. Once he won the 0 round of the elections, markets panicked. So markets don't believe in his economic program. But basically, populists, by offering simple solutions, as Andres has said, undermine business environment. And so business leaders often watch what's going on. And this is why when populists win, markets often panic. Donald Trump was an exception. Donald Trump has done 2 different things. On one hand, he deregulated a lot. And in some cases, it was bad for the environment, but good for business investment in certain sectors. So markets actually rallied after he started governing. On the other hand, he created protectionist barriers, which actually undermine business opportunities. And if you look at counterfactual analysis of Donald Trump's economics until pandemic, it was net zero, if you like. I'm using net zero in a very different sense. But basically, his impact on the economy, the negative impact through protectionism and the positive impact through deregulation was actually balanced. So the picture is complex, but if you want in one word, populists attack complex institutions, which we put together to reassure investors. And these attacks usually undermine business environment and therefore economic growth.
Absolutely, and so talking about kind of destabilizing a little bit the landscape, increased volatility.
Sometimes a little bit and sometimes a lot.
And exactly, so that's something that businesses then find themselves having to navigate and having to understand. So actually there was a piece on the Financial Times recently speaking about how maybe businesses now need like a chief political officer or something like that, chief populism officer, I don't know.
Employment opportunities for you guys.
So I don't know if you can speak to...
Yeah, look, I have this conversation often with people in business here in Europe and Latin America. Business people tend to be skeptical of politicians for a very good reason, because a lot of politicians talk rubbish. But the attitude of a business leader who says, just let me do my work, let me do my investments, politics is for the politicians, that is one of the most narrow-minded and myopic things that a business leader can think or say. For one very simple reason, because markets don't exist in the ether. Markets exist in institutions. They're embedded in countries. And those institutions are designed, regulated, changed by politics. And if the politics works badly, the institutions that govern markets will work badly, and markets will work badly, and therefore businesses will lose money. So, you know, being interested in politics, being conversant about politics, and being worried about crazy politicians is something that every business leader, including people in this room, should do. The attitude, oh, that's politics, that's not my business, I think is incredibly, incredibly narrow-minded. I did want to add one caveat, or I'm not going to disagree with Sergey, but there's one wrinkle that I worry about. Modern liberal democracies are liberal not because they're pro-market. They are liberal because they impose checks and balances on the will of the majority. Democracy is the rule of the majority. Liberal democracy is the rule of the majority with safeguards for the minority. So liberal democracies have independent courts. We don't vote for judges or Supreme Court justice. They have independent regulators. They have independent central banks, and so on and so forth. And I'm in favor of that. in fact, in my country, push for, some independence for things like fiscal policy. So the technocrat in me wants to say that's very desirable. The politician in me wants to say, look, we want some of that, but it's not evident what the optimum is. My good friend and one of my favorite political scientists around the world, a guy called Yascha Mounk, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, wrote a book, a very good book about 4 or 5 years ago called The People Against Democracy, in which he says liberal democracy is great and we need these safeguards and checks and balances, but let us not be surprised if the guy in Leeds or the guy in Lille or the guy in Sao Paulo, Brazil says, hey, who elected these people, right? And why the hell are they ruling over the Congress or over my elected representatives? And I sometimes wonder, half of my brain says this is great, the other half of my brain says we may have gone a little bit too far. And the danger, of course, is that we delegitimize democracy and we get the kind of crazy backlash we've been having.
Absolutely. And so you also mentioned, since this is something that business leaders can't really shy away from, it's part of the reality. How do you feel, on the other hand, business leaders have impacted populism? Or, I mean, I'm thinking like Cambridge Analytica, or like even now Elon Musk with Twitter. Like, what do you...
That's a question that is difficult to ask in general, because the political role and the legitimacy and the public role of the business community is very different across countries. I worry about, yes, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and all of that, but I worry more about something else, which is this. The claim that populists make is a claim about being good and pure and being bad and corrupt. Capitalism cannot work unless capitalists are in the good and pure camp. And capitalists have to work hard to remain in that camp. And if I am a populist, and not only a left-wing populist, it is very, very easy to tar business people. Oh, they're corrupt, they bribe, or even if they don't corrupt or bribe, they're insensitive, they live in their gated communities, they have very aggressive tax strategies, they send their kids to school abroad, they never use public services. What do they know about my plight if they've never stood in a queue to get, health care? So I worry about the future of liberal democracy from the point of view of the legitimacy of the business community and of legitimacy of markets. Because in the end, we sophisticated people know, as the economist likes to say, that you can be pro-market without being pro-business. In fact, you can be pro-market and maybe be quite tough on business. But for most voters, business people, markets, capitalism, whatever, it's the same thing, right? So if there are 3 business people who are not quite in the pure and chaste camp, that really casts a big shadow over the whole sector. And if I am an enterprising populist leader, that's, it's fodder for my cannon. That's perfect, right? So, again, this probably happens less in Sweden than it happens in Brazil, but still, that danger, I think, is very, very worrisome. And I don't see many people in the world of business having acknowledged it first or having done something about it second.
What about you, Sergey? Do you...
I agree, but let me go a bit further, in a sense that populists don't have a great reputation for actually being successful anti-corruption fighters.
No.
So populists...
You're putting it very politely here.
Yes.
In fact, that's a very British wording.
Yes. So Bolsonaro built his campaign 2018 on anti-corruption campaign, and he was right. The incumbents were quite corrupt.
Indeed.
By Russian standards, it's...
Exactly.
People couldn't believe that we talk about 2-3% kickback in the state oil company, and president has to be impeached. But anyway, it happened.
Exactly.
And
they're also apprentices, like Trump.
Exactly, exactly. So this kind of oil sector corruption, Russia probably is doing better than others. But so Bolsonaro was correct. The incumbents were corrupt, but Bolsonaro doesn't seem to be a paragon of honesty and integrity himself.
No.
And this is actually quite clear why. This is not a bug, but a feature of populist system. Once you destroy the checks and balances, you have temptation, and you have business people who want to benefit from that. And this is something which emerges as a very dangerous combination, which Italian-American economist Luigi Zingales calls Medici vicious circle. Now, this is the most important export of Italy. When in the circle of people doing political economy, special populism, we have disproportionate representation of Italians for a reason. Because Medici's already, one of the Medici's had a motto which said, money to get power, power to protect money. And basically, you have this vicious circle. Some business people benefit from this, and populists can come to power and say, now we'll deliver to people. But actually what we observe, and again, this is something we do observe, that once you destroy the political institutions, some business people benefit. Now, for students in this room, I don't recommend this. Being a friend of a populist, benefiting from crony capitalist system of a populist is a short-term proposition. Eventually, it's not good for your long-term share returns. But overall, this is the system they built. And Berlusconi, in modern times, Berlusconi was the current Medici. He used his media empire to get to power. He used power to add to his media empire and to make more money in his non-media business. So this is a typical Italian Medici of 20th, 21st century. And this is what worries me a lot. So populists, if you have anti-corruption campaigner who says the elites are corrupt, I clean it up, that's not bad per se. There are many corrupt elites around the world. But populists, as Andres correctly said, don't stop there. They destroy checks and balances, and they build crony capitalist system for themselves. And again, there are business opportunities there if you're a crony. But don't forget that sometimes there is a debate between whether the president or the crony is more powerful. And it's almost always the case that politics trumps economics. Sorry for my pun intended.
As we know from Russia.
As we know from Russia as well.
Yeah. As I listened to you, I was thinking of, there are lots of good quips and sayings about rich politicians. My favorite one comes from Mexico. It comes from the PRI, the party that governed Mexico for 60-some years. This is from Spanish, but let me try a translation. They used to say, a politician who is poor is a poor politician, which I think is very accurate. It's a dangerous, slippery slope, right?
So we have on the one side business leaders who can be friends of populist politicians. They can become populist politicians. What about some good tips that you have for business leaders in general? What do you wish you'd see more from the business community that would help us fight this battle against populism?
Well, I fully agree with Andres. Business leaders should remember they don't exist in vacuum, and they should take into account political challenges, and they should think about those issues. And sometimes they should understand that they're facing political risks. You invest in a country, you see that assets are underpriced, you should think why. You should think why. Maybe markets are stupid, they don't see the great opportunities. But maybe you should think about potential expropriation risks. And in my life, I've seen a lot of people who thought we will profit from this boom, from that boom. And 2022 in Russia has showed that sometimes you may have to write down 100%, right? And so in that sense, political risks are extremely important. And that's why liberal democracies are actually the great recipients of foreign direct investment. That's because these are the countries where business feels protected. That may change. United States, as Andres has said, is still not an emerging country, but that may change next year.
It's working hard to go that way.
They are working hard. But overall, this is just something to think about a lot, and always to remember that populist politicians lie. And this is, again, not a bug, but a feature of a populist narrative. Right. You cannot deliver on those promises. You try to mislead your voters. Some populist politicians are honest. Some populist politicians deliver on their promises. But the majority of them actually lie, underperform, and they try to subvert democratic institutions to stay in power. And this is where I fully agree with my friend Elias. You need to read my book, Spin Dictators.
Great. Andres, would you like to add anything else in terms of advice to business leaders?
I'm not very good with advice, but let me try one thing. The business community in many countries, especially countries with these kinds of problems at the forefront, needs to be a lot more proactive. I'll give you one very concrete example. My country had a slew of price-fixing, monopoly rigging scandals. I feel some responsibility for that because I was the guy that changed the law that allowed the prosecutors to do things like tap phones, and they began saying, "Oh my God!" They began, getting conversations. Shall we agree on prices? And then, after we have, throw the computers into the river. Okay, and this is all on tape. So, surprise, 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 the credibility of the business community went down the drain. The biggest scandal involved toilet paper. Imagine the potential for memes when you learn that, in fact, people have been tampering with your toilet paper. I mean, it's so, it seemed to me that the obvious thing that the business community should do is not simply to issue some blanket statement saying that they believe in transparency. We can all do that. They asked me once at a meeting, I wasn't in government, I was just an economist going to a conference. I said, look, very simple, guys. Put your money put your hand in your pocket, raise $1 million among all of you, peanuts for you, go to London or to Cambridge or to Palo Alto, hire the best competition economists in the world, and write a bill that would propose 3 changes to the current, statute in Chile that would make sure that these scandals could never happen again, okay? And you pay for it, you take the lead, and you show the country that, in fact, not only are you issuing blanket statements, you're willing to pay to bring Luigi Zingales or whatever to design a law, okay? And again, $1 million, it's not going to cost you a lot of money. I mean, I don't think Luigi would pay them $1 million, but, the whole project, right, and they said, oh, what a good idea. They never did it. Why? Because they don't think in these terms, that you need to be proactive. You need to understand that this problem is your problem. You need to understand that talk is cheap, and the only way people will believe you is if you actually spend money and run risks. Why a risk? Because if you bring an American academic or a British academic, he or she might write a bill you don't like. Well, life is tough, right? You need to be able to live with that risk. Never did it.
Let me actually follow up on this. Politics is all about divide and rule, about opportunity to get together and do something for the common good or not. And indeed, if business people can see a common good for the business community, and not just for single businesses who can profit from cartel agreements or from subsidies from the government for one company, if a business association can get together and prevent politicians to pick them one by one, that's exactly what needs to be done. This is what voters should do, this is what politicians should do, and this is what civic society should do, including associations of legitimate business people.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that advice. Hopefully we have enough people planned in enough countries that will be able to do this internationally. We're now going to move to some questions from the audience. I'm thinking of having a bit of a structured discussion, so we'll start first with some general questions about whether it's like the origin, causes of implication of populism, and then we're going to go after a few on to like more of a regional discussion. So if you have any questions about Russia or LATAM or anything else, maybe we'll keep them for a little later. Why don't we start? We have someone right there who wants a question.
Thank you very much for the really insightful discussion. My question is around when the populist regimes that you've studied, when they come to an end, how are there commonalities in how they come to an end, and what replaces them? Is it another populist regime, or is it eventually another liberal democracy, or a liberal democracy for those who've never had that?
Well, Andres will tell you about the populist cycle of 20th century, where indeed a populist creates a macroeconomic mess, is succeeded by somebody like Andres, who imposes an unpopular discipline, and then is followed by another populist, and then another mess. But so
that's Argentina, no? That's not my country.
It's not your country. Not yet your country. But actually, this Dornbusch and Edwards book is all about this. Yeah. Several case studies like this with the whole cycle. So I'll give you an example. We've been doing UK bashing a lot, but actually last weekend I was on a conversation with Martin Wolf in a book festival about his book, Democratic Capitalism. It's a very pessimistic book, and I said, this book was finished a year ago. Are you more pessimistic or more optimistic this year? And he said, I'm more optimistic because we got rid of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss without a civil war. This is actually not as obvious because in the US, Donald Trump didn't want to step down without violence, right? So these are all difficult things. I mentioned to you that populists usually don't step down without a fight. They try to hold on to power, and this is very scary. And sometimes people stand up to them. Civil society that Andres was talking about, that is legitimate businesses, lawyers, experts, journalists, activists, and defend the institutions. Institutions don't come to us from Mars. Eventually, these are people who write those laws, and there are people who take to the street to defend these laws. And sometimes liberal democracies stand up, and sometimes they collapse. And Andres showed the example of Orban. Orban came to power the second time. First time he was prime minister. The second time he came to prime minister, and he went institution by institution, courts, media, state business. He subverted them all, and now it's very hard to get rid of him. And he will be succeeded by liberal democracy at some point. It's hard to imagine it otherwise for a country in the heart of Europe. But when, we don't know. And maybe he will stay there for life. So these are all difficult questions.
I would add one thought. You asked what happens when they leave. I worry about what happens if they don't leave. Maybe that's a way of summarizing Sergei's very good answer. They like to stay. And look, I'm sure you've all come across the book by two Harvard professors on the end of democracies, and they make a very good point. Once upon a time, coups used to be big affairs with guys in green fatigues firing missiles at government buildings. That kind of doesn't happen anymore. I mean, actually, we had one or two in Africa recently, but in much of the world, that doesn't happen anymore. You get the death of democracy by 1,000 cuts in a much more subtle but much more insidious way, right? Which is Orban tampers with the electoral laws here, with the redistricting over there, with the campaign finance laws here, with the rules for appointing Supreme Court justices, and you wake up one morning and the guy has unchecked power, right? But there was no coup, there were no missiles, there were no tanks on the street. And that is really tricky. And of course, we're prepared to accept that in countries that are not, at the margins of Europe. Sorry, Hungarians, for saying that. But the point that Levitsky and Ziblatt make in their book is that could it happen in a core country like the United States? I don't know. I lived in the U.S. 18 years, so I find it hard to fathom. But the more I look at the world today, the more plausible I find it. And it's a very frightening thought indeed.
One more question. Oh, so many hands. Well, where is the first? Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing. And my question is, because the research has shown that rising populism has led to a slowdown economic growth, and it's a really concrete finding. But actually, my question is that a bad word? Because actually, we are talking about slowdown economic growth, like in the context of capitalism, which means that actually, like a very high economic growth can also enlarge the inequality between the very rich people and the very poor people. So in that context, do you agree that, or what's your opinion on like the slowdown economic growth is is either an indicator for market inefficiencies or like ineffective resource allocations, or it is just a sacrifice for more equal nation? Like maybe it lead to lower Gini coefficient.
Can I take that? Because I feel very strongly about this. I cannot tell you how important growth is. And I cannot overemphasize how dangerous the talk of no growth is.
In France, they talk about degrowth.
Yeah, but they do it in French, so nobody really understands, right? No, I really mean this. I really mean this. And let me be a little bit more academic about it. First of all, most human development outcomes are incredibly correlated with GDP per capita. I have a colleague at the LSE who used to be at Harvard, a guy called Land Pritchard, who's written a bunch of papers about this. If you want to improve human development in any dimension, health, education, welfare, the single biggest predictor is income per capita, okay? So the idea that you're going to have high human welfare without high income per capita is simply not in the data anywhere. The second thing is that, I always find it somewhat paradoxical that the only people who think about degrowth are the rich. I've never met somebody from South Asia or from Latin America or from Sub-Saharan Africa who says, oh, growth is a terrible thing. So, you know, it's really a rich world conceit. Let's not spend too much time on it.
I fully agree, 100% agree with Andres. I would add that inequality matters. People worry about inequality, and politicians should think how to use the fruits of growth to make sure that nobody is left behind. We agree on this. In addition, there is also a degrowth climate discussion, and this is exactly what Andres has said. People said climate change is more important than global poverty. And then people say something like this. We have 10% of global population who live in extreme poverty, but they almost don't pollute. So if we bring them to the extreme poverty threshold, which is $2 per day, actually pollution will not go up a lot. And that's true. Pollution would go up by 2%. So you think there is no trade-off between poverty and fighting climate change. The truth is, of course, these people don't want $2 per day. These people want to have English level of income per capita, English level of quality of life. The way Andres has formulated.
You're not being very ambitious here.
I come from France. Yeah. But honestly, then, if you look around the world, then you see that, indeed, people from South Asia don't say, we want $2 per day, that's enough for us. They want the level of income of people who come to the classrooms like this and say we should have degrowth.
Can I add one thought on climate change, because I didn't mention it? This is my third conference of the day, so if I'm not making much sense, forgive me. But I went to the ODI conference on development this morning, and we had a discussion exactly about this. And there's one point that seldom gets made, and it is this. If we're going to be serious about climate change and a green transition, we're going to have to get people off cars that run on fuel and into cars that run on electricity. This means that we're going to have to produce a lot more things like copper or lithium or rare earths. And that means that the world is going to have more trade and not less trade. And there's a reflex that I find mostly at dinner parties in North London that says, if we want to get rid of global warming, we have to stop extractivism. And that gets it exactly upside down. Okay, this is not about populism, how to get into this. But it is important because, you know, I take global warming very seriously. I come from a country that is very exposed, but we need to do more mining, not less mining, to fix it. And more trade, not less trade, to fix it.
Great, thank you. Any also regional questions that we haven't had a chance to? Maybe someone from this side, we haven't taken this side. Anyone with a regional question? There.
Hi, thank you for the session. My question was not about a particular region, but basically about a division of regions, for example, in developing countries versus developed countries or developed economies. Do you think populism developing countries have a more conducive environment for the growth of populism as against developed countries due to the social and economic inequalities?
This is, I see Andres doesn't want to take this question.
I'll take it, I'll take it. No, look, first of all, I want to thank everybody in this room because I've heard people using that phrase, developing countries, and not the terrible, awful word or phrase, the global south. Nobody has said global south. Thank you. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible thing to say. On to your question. I used to think what you just said, that, you know, clearly countries in which people are poor, they have more reason to be upset, and therefore this is fodder for populism. But, you know, the last 20 years have suggested otherwise. You know, just to say one word more on the correlation between economic outcomes and inequality. And, you know, I've said things that may sound right-wing, so I want to say something that's going to sound very left-wing, so I can leave here. I think we are the victims of what I will call Anglo-American cultural imperialism, meaning realities from two English-speaking countries get projected onto the rest of the world. The standard story about populism in the US and the UK is the stagnation of the median wage and the left-behind areas, you know, Gary, Indiana, Sheffield, and North England. That's perfectly true about these two countries. But if I look around the world, India, the Philippines, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, the median wage in those countries, measured in any way, is 3 times or 4 times in real terms what it was 25, 30 years ago, right? So the easy translation of these theories generated in the rich countries of the North Atlantic to the explanation of populism in India under Mr. Modi or Orban or Bolsonaro, that's very bad social science, okay? So that's why I tend to be, you were reflecting one set of data in Europe, which makes that point very strongly. If we look at other bits of data, and of course we have less data, regrettably, in other corners of the world, I think the story is very, very different.
I would say a few words about Turkey. I think it's a very important example where you actually have a project of Ataturk, which is a secular European but non-democratic project. So the country was run in a way which was neglecting people left behind, not in economic terms, but actually in cultural terms. And so Erdogan used that. Erdogan said, I come from your part of the country. I'm not a cosmopolitan seaside elite, and I will protect you from this military conspiracy, military elite educated conspiracy.
This military-industrial complex.
Exactly, military-industrial complex with universities, journalists, and judges coming from big cities.
Precisely.
And so the wage went up in all parts of Turkey, but he used this actually non-democratic setting created 100 years ago. And he said, we need to move to democracy, and that's a real concern. But of course, Turkey today is less of a democracy than 20 years ago.
Exactly.
And so this is a typical populist. And again, if anybody tells you that Erdogan is not corrupt, there are many people who would disagree with you.
Not including you, obviously. Amazing. More questions, maybe this side. Who's got the microphone again? Where is it? Okay, thank you. Maybe inside the... Oh, sorry, I didn't see you. Next one. There's so many.
Okay, I will be first, probably, yeah. I'm from Kazakhstan, and for instance, 30 years, we hadn't policy at all because like we was run by one president for 30 years. Now, like he's run out of power, and like second president trying to like do some democratic reforms, and we can see that there are a lot of writing of populism in Kazakhstan, and like which steps we can do in order to like stop this rising. Like probably there's like a relationship between, I don't know, education expenditures and like populism acceptance. Yeah.
Well, Kazakhstan is an interesting country, which is not a populist country, indeed. And there is a whole chapter in Spin Dictators about this. And this is a beautiful example, as every dictator says, we'll build Singapore. Exactly. And only one dictator built Singapore, that was Lee Kuan Yew.
Exactly.
And he fought corruption. He did not undermine checks and balances. With all his non-democratic tendencies, he actually investigated his own family for corruption. Now, the other dictators who say we are not populists, we'll build a prosperous society like Singapore, somehow their families become rich, they themselves become rich, and Kazakhstan, unfortunately, is an example like this. Now, if the second president wants to build a prosperous democratic society, he just should. And so far, unfortunately, I can tell you, elections have not been free and fair. The political scientists around the world don't consider Kazakhstan, even today, with a second president, as a democracy. This particular president was not selected through free and fair elections. So populists are usually people, there are authoritarian populists who want to turn their society into non-democracies. But populism is usually something which is a feature of a democratic political system. So they want to be spin dictators, but they're not yet. And of course, Kazakhstan is not yet a populist country because it's not yet a democratic country.
Can I add one word? I don't know as much as you do about Kazakhstan, but I have been there once or twice. It has a very good technocracy, very able technocrats. I know this because many went to the Kennedy School and they were my students. That's the only connection that I have with the place. But the talk about liberalization does not match the reality on liberalization. And because Kazakhstan is endowed with good technocrats and with lots of natural resources, and also with pretty decent wine too, there's an opportunity there. But that opportunity will only come to pass if, in fact, the talk about political reform is real. It isn't so far, and Sergey is absolutely right.
Great. We also had one down there. Maybe you can pass the microphone. Oh, thank you so much. And then I'm going to...
Hi, thanks first off for this fantastic conversation. It's been a brilliantly framed topic that, to be honest, I didn't know an awful lot about before coming in here, beyond local media. One of the things that I found really interesting was the framing of left and right, the kind of the us and the elites, and the us and the other, and then the populace almost universally putting themselves in the good and pure camp. Now, I come from a kind of climate background, and that to me doesn't quite fit. Like, how do the populists, who almost unilaterally are making movements against climate change, very kind of much supportive of oil and gas industries, how does that frame with either the elites, the other, or the good and pure?
See, you're starting from an assumption which may not be entirely correct. You're starting from an assumption that the populists' claim to being the people's representative is based on some fact or some congruence. Look, Donald Trump sells himself as a man of the people, and he does come from Queens, which is. But other than that, he inherited a fortune, right? And he's a rich guy. How much? What's the net worth? I don't know, because there are lots of assets and lots of liabilities, so it's anybody's guess, right?
And assets are not properly valued.
As we learned this morning, yes. But the point I'm trying to make is that, a short-fingered vulgarian, as the New Yorker once called him, who is a property tycoon, is not the most natural candidate for a spokesman of the people, right? And there he is, right? So the notion that the only spokesman for the people is somebody who rose from below is, nice and romantic, but it doesn't work that way. I mean, go around the world, and most of the people who are populist leaders have very few in their CVs that would make them, spokesmen for, the people, but there they are. Sometimes they're there because they personify resentment. In other cases, the fact that they're corrupt is good. I mean, I've heard people say, oh, he's stolen enough in a previous life, now that he doesn't have to steal anymore. And there may be some truth for that. Of course, in some cases they're there because there is some ethnic divide, and they're kind of, from one group, and they will put their big foot on the other group. But there's very little basis on fact, so don't look for it because you won't find it.
Let me just one thing on climate and populists. So until recently, we almost had no green populists. You may say Five-Star Movement in Italy is a bit of an environmental movement. Not really. It really doesn't have a program. But why don't we have green populists, at least until recently? Because green narrative is very complex. And it relies on elites. It relies on experts. It relies on scientists. And this is, Andres is correct. For populists dislike the elites, dislike people who pretend to be too educated. And so until recently, it was very hard to imagine a green populist. Today, things are changing in the sense that you don't need science to understand that climate change is real. You observe it, you feel it. And maybe things will change. But actually, in the last European elections, we had the rise of green parties, but it was still not populist parties. And in the graphs that I showed you, for example, the rise of mobile broadband, internet, and social media helped populists, but didn't help green parties because their narrative is too complex to propagate through 140 characters.
And in addition, populism is all about identity, which I didn't emphasize enough. And so the identity of green advocates doesn't get you close to power. Green advocates are university graduates who live in big cities and take the metro. And as the Gilets jaunes told Monsieur Macron, in no uncertain terms, what do you know about my plight? I drive a truck in the north of France where it's rainy and miserable all the time, and and nobody gives me a subsidy, right? So, the urban dweller who worries about climate change and the man who loves fossil fuels, they have very little in common. I mean, I as a former politician, I love good political lines. I forget which one of the leaders of the Gilets jaunes said something unforgettable. He said, the president is worried about the end of the world. My family is worried about getting to the end of the month. That's pretty hard to beat, right? And so, you know, green populism is going to be an uphill battle, but who knows? It may come.
We also have a ton of questions on Zoom, so I'm just going to mention at least one, which talks about how political parties need to push populism. Now they're feeling that, like, I guess, a push to push populistic policies to get reelected, but at the same time, they're not really getting the results they're promising. So, what, you know, in terms of, like, how do we go from here? Like, can we fix democracy? Is there, like, a different kind of democracy you should be pushing? Is this the system that's working for us?
Let me mention one thing, since Andres mentioned yellow vests, gilets jaunes. I think this is what happened afterwards is a potential path to a solution. What is the problem with populists? Populists usually point at the right problem. So you mentioned gilets jaunes. Indeed, President Macron decided to impose a tax on fuel. It was a very small tax, but it coincided with a hike in oil prices. And basically, the story is exactly as Andres has put it. I live in Paris. My electric bus is subsidized by the government.
Right.
And I'm not poor. Somebody lives in the rural area, needs to drive a truck or a car to work, so his diesel fuel is more expensive now. So there is a real problem, and it needs to be discussed somewhere. Now, the problem is that President Macron comes from the elite. Right. The parliament is also elite, right? And since we do US bashing, in the US, college degree is very important. 40% of US voters have a college degree. 95% of US Congress people have college degree. So they don't represent the public. And so how do you bridge this gap? And this is exactly what has happened in France since. It's not optimal, but it's actually done in many countries, including this country, what's called deliberative democracy. In addition to representative democracy, where you elect members of parliaments, you organize a debate. And you involve ordinary people. How do you do that? You create what's called mini-public. So you randomly select 150 people or 1,000 people and get them to debate stuff. And issues like gay marriage, issues like abortion, in such Catholic country like Ireland, were actually decided through Citizens' Assembly. And that's where you rebuild the trust in political decision making, because you don't elect rich and educated people. You randomly pick ordinary people. They debate, they deliberate, and this is something that is trying to rebuild the trust in political progress. And I think this is a concrete thing which is now being tried in many countries, and I'm very optimistic about this path.
I hope you're right. If I were a believer, I would pray to the gods that you're right, but I'm not sure. This may be the most important question of them all, because people in this room, I hope, we all believe in liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is under siege, and honestly of God, we don't quite know what to do about it. Let me try a different tack. And I'm trying to write a book about this with a co-author, but it's proving a very hard book to write. What is it about liberalism that turns citizens against the institutions of liberalism? I don't have a good answer, but let me mention three things. One is democracy works well when it is mediated, when there are institutions standing between the voter and those who wield power. Populism is about the destruction of those mediators. You know, Donald Trump speaks for the people. Modi speaks for the people. Orban speaks for the people. And part of the problem is that those institutions in the middle are very, very weak. And in particular, one we need to reinvent, and that's a political party. Political parties, nobody likes political parties, right? You know, if you say, you know, you tell your grandmother, you know, Granny, I'm joining a political party, and your grandmother will not invite you for lunch on Sunday, right? But political parties are incredibly important. And the fact that they have fallen apart is very, very serious. You know, Brazil has 22 political parties. Chile has 22 political parties. Could you possibly, you know, de Gaulle said you couldn't run France because it had 200 kinds of cheese, right? 400. But I think he said 200, right? Maybe they've created 200 since. In any case, a lot of kinds of cheese, right? You know, you cannot rule a country with 400 kinds of cheese. You cannot rule a country with 22 parties in parliament. I mean, so we need to have few strong political parties, and I have few. Second of all, and I want to say something which is going to sound quite shocking. You know, I've lived in 7 countries all my life. I grew up in North Africa. You know, I am, you know, that evil cosmopolitan person that you've heard about. Nonetheless, I think that we need to reinvent what I would call liberal nationalism or liberal patriotism. because people in this room are very easy to hate. Oh, you know, you're from Greece, but where does he live? You know, in central London, right? And right, and where does he send his kids to school? You know, to some posh school in England, right? So you know, we need to reinvent. You know, social glue is about having something in common. Very large scale is not amenable to social glue. That's why the European project always has a problem, because it's cool to be European in the abstract, but nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm European. People say, I'm Italian, I'm Irish, right? You know, euro notes don't have people on them. They have buildings. I mean, how excited can you really get about a bunch of buildings, right? So I think we need to reinvent a liberal and inclusive brand of nationalism, which is not xenophobic, which is not prejudice, which is not based on blood and soil like American right-wingers say, but which is based on shared values of inclusiveness and democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And the last thing we need, and I think you're going to agree with this because you sort of said it already, but I'm going to say it in a different way. You guys are, you know, business people. You know what the HR department is. You know, democratic parties need an HR department. I mean, look at the liberal leaders in the world today. Justin Trudeau. What does Dad do? He was the prime minister. What does Mother do? She used to party with the Rolling Stones, right? That doesn't get any more elite than that, right? Emmanuel Macron. I mean, the guy doesn't sweat, right? I mean, he wears a white shirt and a blue tie even on weekends, right? You know, he went to l'ENA. I mean, he's the ultimate énarque, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Leave Europe and Canada for a minute, you know. You know, India, the voice of democracy is Rahul Gandhi. You know, very nice guy, Oxford educated, whatever. His father, grandmother, grandfather, and they're all prime ministers, right? So, you know, in Argentina, you know, the great liberal hope was Macri. Not a bad guy, but, you know, the man is the son of a billionaire whose main claim to fame is that he owned a football team, right? And, you know, he married several times, you know, always very rich and beautiful women who tended to be models, right? So, look, is it surprising that the average man or woman on the street looks at these people and says, oh my God, why should I vote for them, right? John Kerry, I was living in the States when John Kerry was president. He would have been a great president of the United States. I mean, he was running for president, right? He would have been a great president, but, you know, he spoke in French and he liked surfing, you know, in the Mediterranean, right? So, you know, so we need a new HR department for liberal democratic parties. The HR department is not doing its job.
I fully agree. I would just add one thing. Being a democratic leader is hard today. You need to be very sophisticated because you need to face challenges like climate change, regulation of platforms, thinking about all these complex issues. So you need to be educated. You need to go through these elite institutions, have a lot of relevant experience. And at the same time, you have to be in touch with the people. And that's Andres' point. But combining these two things is hard.
But to be in touch with the people, you must have met a few people in your life,
correct.
Right? And
well, you have no time because you study all the time.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. But if, you know, if you went to boarding school like John Kerry, or if you went to ENA, like, you know, l'ENA, like Macron, you never had a chance to meet people, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're well over time. Maybe just a last one. If you had to take one thing that people want people to remember, maybe in 20 seconds each, a last message.
I think I just said
today.
It. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm going to repeat something we said in passing. You know, you asked for advice, and I always turn a little bit pink in the face when I deliver advice. So, like, people in this room are going, you know, there are a few academics. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to future business leaders who will really run the world. Guys, politics is so important. Never think that it is, as they say in England, beyond your remit. If you're going to be a political leader, and I mean a business leader, and you don't understand how politics works and how the state works and how your first job is to make your country, sorry, your company, not your country, your company legitimate, not liked, not feared, but respected and legitimate, a legitimate actor in society. That's your first job, and most business people have no clue how to do that. I mean, I'll add one thought. I promise I will shut up. You know, when I was in government in Chile, the thing that struck me most when I met business people is that they did not understand a word of how the state worked. You know, some newspaper would publish a headline saying, "Bill to do this is, you know, imminent," and I would say, guys, one minister said that a commission may be set up to study a bill which then would have to be approved by the cabinet and then would have to go to parliament. It would take 5 years. We don't have the votes. It's never going to. And these people would look at me as though I was speaking in some foreign language. They had no idea how this worked. They had no notion of how politics was conducted, how parliament worked, how you veto or didn't veto. I mean, business people are worryingly ignorant about politics and the state. Unless, of course, you went to LBS, in which you're all very sophisticated. So we need more of that.
Amazing. Well, Andres, Sergey, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you come back soon to LBS. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta.